Hello, everyone. My name is Christy Amobi, and with me here today is C-Treat's Chief Scientific Officer, Professor Paul Keall. We're delighted to be here today to talk to you more about the offline radiation therapy landscape and ways new technology approaches can help make offline adaptive evaluation a reality for everyone. Along with his role as C-Treat's Chief Scientific Officer, Professor Keall is the director of the ImageX Institute at the University of Sydney. His extensive research experience has positively impacted both the science and clinical practice of radiation therapy. Today, we'll learn a little bit more about why offline adaptive radiation therapy is a priority and how new software solutions must be automated, accurate, and cost-effective to expand global access. Professor Keall will be available for Q&A following the presentation. Thanks again for your attention, and with that, I'll hand it over to Professor Keall.
Thank you, Christy. It's a pleasure to be here today to be talking with you about expanding global access to offline adaptive radiation therapy. I'm Paul Keall, and I've been very lucky to be fortunate to be part of the journey that I think the radiation oncology research field has taken to really account for anatomic changes that occur to patients throughout a course of radiation therapy. And I've had leadership roles at Stanford University and the University of Sydney, and it's a pleasure to be talking about the current journey as the Chief Scientific Officer of C-Treat. And C-Treat is a Sydney-based company, and really with the goal to reduce the burden of cancer and develop AI products that make personalized cancer treatment accessible to patients and clinics globally. And there's a fantastic team of people, and you'll be able to meet some of these people at ESTRO 2025 for those who are attending. So I've really dedicated a lot of my research career to accounting for changes in patient anatomy, and really adaptive radiation therapy is at the heart of that. And so the three key messages I want you to get from this presentation is firstly that offline is the most urgent adaptive radiation therapy need, that offline adaptive radiotherapy will benefit patients and healthcare systems, and thirdly, that there's a lot of challenges and that access, technical difficulty, and automation barriers really need to be overcome in order to be able to deliver efficient, accurate, and cost-effective adaptive radiation therapy tools. So just setting the scene a little bit, we're talking about cancer and global expansion, and so we really need to consider the target market or people who are going to benefit from improved tools. I like the title of this paper, Developing World Global Warning, and that the global incidence of cancer is larger in developing countries or low and middle income countries than it is in high income countries. So it's a bigger problem. The ratio of deaths per incidence is also higher. And as we can see from this plot, the rate of increase is faster than in the developed countries. So if we really want to have a global impact, we need to be developing tools that are globally deployable. And some work from one of my colleagues, Michael Barton, 50% of cancer patients will benefit from radiation therapy. So it's more than 10 million of the 20 million patients newly diagnosed with cancer each year. And we want to be clear that we're not just developing technology for technology's sake, that there is a history of technology achievements that have really made a difference to patients. And just three of the examples are shown here, that simply with deep inspiration breath hold, there's a 50% decreased cardiac risk for left-sided breast cancer patients. For the introduction of lung stereotactic ablative radiation therapy showed that there can be equivalent and better outcomes for patients treated in 3 fractions versus the tradition of 25 or 30 fractions. And that means so much for the patients and their carers as far as the access and time spent being treated at a very vulnerable time of their lives. And also, more recently, that there has been 50% fewer side effects from prostate cancer treatment with advanced cancer targeting. And so we really want to be sure that technology is going to have a meaningful impact on patient lives. And there's evidence that I'll talk about later that adaptive radiotherapy is going to have that difference. So there's in business, they talk about this iron triangle, and it's very hard to be both automated, accurate, and cost effective. And often you're choosing two of those. Whereas what we want to be is to be developing solutions that can do all three: automated, accurate, and cost effective. And I'd just like a shout out to my colleague Lawrence Court at MD Anderson, who's really managed to do this on a global scale with the radiation therapy planning assistant that was published in Lancet Oncology. And this is an FDA-approved system, deployed at MD Anderson, and also deployed with some of the partner centers around the globe, just to show that these automated, accurate, and cost-effective tools are achievable, which is what we're implementing at C-Treat. And for those not as familiar with adaptive radiation therapy, we'll just go back and have a brief primer. And really the founding of adaptive radiotherapy was from this paper, which at the time was very significant, from D. Yan and colleagues at the William Beaumont Hospital in Detroit. And what they did was to take multiple CT scans of patients and to use that information to determine what the best treatment plan is for that patient going forward. And this was published 28 years ago. And it's just staggering that sort of a technology which has shown so much benefit is not available routinely for patients today in a fast, automated, cost-effective manner. So I think this is really like a call to arms to improve the access that we have to adaptive radiation therapy. Now, I think of adaptive radiotherapy somewhat akin to driverless cars, that there's the act of seeing, or which in a car, you've got multiple sensors. Then you take all of the sensor information and you need to think, you need to make a decision, what do we do next? Then there are tools to act on that. And in a car, it's just turning left or right, speeding up or slowing down. It's quite simple. For radiation therapy, it's actually very complex, that we see the patient, we need to acquire images of patients. We're getting images of patients often every day. And then to be understanding, when do we need to make that adaptive decision on a daily basis and for every patient every day? And then, of course, to act on that decision by either continuing the plan or changing up. And there are three timescales of adaptive radiation therapy. There is the offline, which happens between treatments, online, which is happening before a treatment starts, and the real time, which is happening during whilst the patient is being treated. Now, the adaptive radiotherapy process is captured in this paper by Carrie Glide-Hurst et al. On behalf of the NRG Oncology. And just the complexity of the pathway, and shown on the left, we've got the online adaptive, the real-time adaptive, and just each decision point that is needed is shown in this plot for the real-time, and even for offline. When do we need to adapt to the patient's treatment? Are the contours appropriate? Are the clinical objectives met? And has the plan passed QA? So it's a very complex process of adaptive radiotherapy. And how much is adaptive radiotherapy being used around the world? And Jenny Bertollet led an Estro pop art study that surveyed 177 institutions in 40 countries around the world. So 61% perform adaptive radiotherapy, and of those, only 6% are doing online daily replanning, but 15% are using offline ART in protocolized way, and half of these respondents are using offline ad hoc adaptive radiation therapy. So 80% have access to the tools for adaptive radiotherapy, and 2/3 want to implement adaptive radiotherapy for at least one tumor site. So this really points to the need and the desire to improve how we can treat patients with advanced tools. The key barriers to adopting adaptive radiotherapy were also identified in this paper, and the main one is human resources. The second was technical limitations, and the third is equipment and financial resources. So these are all tools that we need to be, when we're looking at solutions, to be thinking about and come back to the points. We need things that are automated, accurate, and cost-effective to overcome these three key barriers. There's a couple of quotes on the slide. Integrating adaptive radiotherapy introduces complexities into the clinical workflow that require thorough benchmarking and evaluation. So adaptive radiotherapy is complex. And also, solutions contribute additional resource strain to an already time-urgent process. And that is not something which is globally scalable. So we need to think of new ways to solve problems. And why are we going to focus on offline adaptive radiotherapy first? Firstly, as I mentioned before, it is the most widely used. Over half of centres surveyed are using offline adaptive radiotherapy. And even though a lot of centres are doing offline adaptive radiotherapy, it is not being received by most of the patients. So in Australia, only 3% of patients are getting adaptive radiotherapy. That means that 97% of patients are not being offered this treatment, being offered this change of treatment, even though for all patients, the anatomy is changing. And the key barrier, because online solutions require additional resources and time, and that's really why we're focusing on the offline adaptive radiation therapy first. So the first key message from this presentation is that offline is the most urgent adaptive radiation therapy need. A key thing behind anything that we're doing is that there has to be clinical drivers behind what we're doing. Again, it's not technology for technology's sake, it's technology for patient's sake. So I'll just summarize some of the clinical drivers and the ASTRO guidelines, the white paper led by Indram Chetty and co-authors. Offline adaptive radiotherapy has been shown to benefit prostate, head and neck, and lung, yielding improved target coverage and organ at risk sparing. And for the head and neck, there's increased local regional control and reduced toxicity. Lung, we've got tumor regression. In breast, there are changes to the lung and heart dose and the change in seroma volume, and also in the prostate. And I will focus in the interest of time, just focus the clinical guidance on head and neck, which is one of the strongest indicators. And I think this patient example, as shown by Morgan and Shear, shows that we've got the tumor changing between the baseline and then fraction 24, so about 2/3 of the way during treatment. So we've got a change in the tumor volume, we've got a substantial reduction in the nodal volumes, and also quite a substantial change, not just in the parotids themselves, but also in the size of the patient due to weight loss. And what this means is that our nice conformal plan that we have for the first time point before the patient starts to get treated just isn't valid anymore by week 5. And so we're seeing an overall increase in the dose to the target. We're losing the target homogeneity, but also seeing an increase in the dose, particularly to the parotid glands. Now, I think this is a very clear illustration of after adaptive radiotherapy that the dose distribution to the patient anatomy, which has changed a lot in this 5 weeks, is actually very similar from a conformality perspective to the original plan. So the adaptive radiotherapy is aligned with the initial intent of the physician at the time of treatment. So if we look at quantifying the benefit of adaptive radiation therapy just for normal tissue sparing, then this is an example from Castelli, when from the original treatment plan, and the patient is shown on the left. Because of weight loss, the patient has shrunk, so the overall unadapted plan is improved and the product doses are getting higher. With the adaptive plan, we see the continued sparing of the parotid gland. And the plan dose here, just illustratively, is shown in the red line. If the original plan had continued to be used, then there's a much higher dose to the parotid glands. With the adapted plan, we're seeing even sparing, even beyond that from the original treatment plan. So just to summarize some of the literature for the head and neck, the Chen paper, 317 patients, there's an increase in local control for replan patients of 88 versus 79%. Similarly, Low et al., that the 5-year local recurrence-free survival was 96.7% versus 88.1%, again, statistically significant. And the Castelli paper that I just showed, there's a 5-gray reduction in per patient, and this corresponds to an 11% reduction in xerostomia, one of the key toxicities from head and neck cancer. There's also just adding a point about the time and the additional time cost of adaptive radiotherapy, that the turnaround time for performing a replan was in 2 to 3 days, but for most centers, and even more than 3 days to replan for 5 centers as well, just indicating that this is a very time-intensive process. So the second key message that I wanted to get across is that offline adaptive radiotherapy will benefit patients and healthcare systems. And if we're reducing recurrence and reducing toxicities, that reduces the cost of care and improves both the lives and livelihoods of cancer patients. Now, the technical challenges for offline adaptive radiation therapy. So in Australia, only 3% of patients receive adaptive radiotherapy and 97% of patients don't. Why is this? And I think that really shown here that there's a long list of tools that are required to enable adaptive radiation therapy. And putting these all together, you can see that each step is quite significant and complex. And I will go through each of these one by one. And there is some good news. For example, if we look at the clinically significant adaptive triggers, and the Energy Oncology review on the state of the art of adaptive radiotherapy, they did a really good job summarizing the guidelines and what needs to be, what the clinically significant changes are across each of the sites in the body, as far as normally looking at changes in either the dose to the CTV, PTV, or GTV, or the critical structures, or a significant change in volume, and just really giving a quantitative metric as when you should adapt. So there's very good guidelines in this document. Also, a good news, one thing we have broad access to is in-room imaging. In the ESTRO survey, 80% of centres do have access to in-room imaging, which is a core tool required for adaptive radiation therapy. Now, once we come to some of the more specific tools, then they're less available. So if we think about deformable image registration, which is it links it very closely to the contour propagation. I really like this example showing for a patient, we go from the planning CT, fraction 12, so only about 1/3 of the way through the treatment. But we can see the tumor volume has started to shrink, and so we're actually seeing sort of like a local deformation, and we're also seeing a shrink at the patient anatomy, is also shrinking, and so we can see quite a lot of deformation at the edge. And there's been a lot of work on deformable image registration and and associated with that contour deformation. The key metrics that we use here are target registration error and also the contour, the clinician contour evaluation. It's very difficult to get a ground truth, and automated solutions really need to be able to demonstrate that the accuracy of these processes. Now, if we step to the two more tools that are needed, the synthetic CT generation and dose calculation. Most people are using cone beam CT for their adaptive radiation therapy protocols. And the cone beam CT, it does have a limited field of view and it's got artifacts. Often the image quality de novo is not that great, but there's also a lot of head and neck cancer patients do have dental fillings which cause artifacts on the images themselves. So this cone beam CT then needs to be back in sort of the broader frame of the CT scan, and also synthetic CT generation is needed so that we can calculate the dose and really quantify the clinical significance of the anatomic changes to decide whether or not to adapt. So there's a lot of complexity in each of the steps that are required in the adaptive radiotherapy process, and really, I think, explain why the technology is not more broadly adopted. And finally, we need automation. So how do we link the clinically significant adaptive triggers? Well, we need decision support that is going to take the evidence or the clinician intent, the clinical intent, into the decision process, and also to be able to automate this process and be able to tell us, red light, okay, we definitely need to replan. Orange, we need to be monitoring this patient. Or green, that it's okay for now. And we want to be doing this on a continuous basis so that we're looking at every patient every day and in an automated way. And I think that's what automation really allows us to, is just to really just probe a lot more information and time points that we can. So just to summarize, the key messages that I wanted to get through today: that offline is the most urgent adaptive radiotherapy need. Offline adaptive radiotherapy will benefit patients and the healthcare system, and that access, technical difficulty, and automation barriers really need to be overcome. At C-Treat, we've been thinking a lot about each of those challenges and how to solve them. And we really look forward to meeting with some of you who can make it and really presenting the solution to the offline adaptive radiotherapy problem in more detail at that time. Thank you very much for your attendance, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Professor Keall, for the great primer on adaptive radiation therapy and for covering some of the limitations with the current systems. As you had noted, it's very exciting to see what's in store at ESTRO, and if anyone would like to book a product demonstration in Vienna, you can do so by scanning the QR code that is shown on your screen. And with that, I'll go ahead and open it up to questions, and I will moderate those here for us today. So as the questions are coming in, first question, you covered a number of things that are opportunities for improvement. What's the biggest opportunity for additional automation?
Right, yeah, thanks, Christy. And I think this really addresses one of the key barriers, that automation, that time is the biggest factor. And really that sort of combines two parts. It's having it's sort of really thinking about the process and where the data is being the data flow, and which of the steps where a human does need and does not need to interact. And so, there's no need to, people shouldn't be pushing data from one system to another. It should all be integrated into a single system. So I think there's sort of the process automation. Then also there's the trust and the verification, because people don't just trust, people aren't just going to blindly trust adaptive systems. And that's where I think the sort of the background of really the rigorous testing in each step of the adaptive process. So from the deformal image registration, contour propagation, we've got the synthetic CT generation and the dose calculation, then the decision support, that there's a lot of sort of validation with each step in those processes, so you can have tools that are automated and that the clinical team are confident that the results they get are useful and are going to help them in their decision making for the adaptive process.
Okay, thank you. How can you reduce costs? There's a few questions around cost enough to increase access in developing countries.
Yes, that's a good point, and and one of the things we're not solving is the access to radiotherapy services in general in low and middle income countries. That hopefully that's probably a government challenge. What we can solve, and we do have a global focus, and to be having if we can, with automation, like one of the challenges is people and time in low and middle income countries. It's particularly fewer resources. So that's really where sort of the automation requirement is much higher. And I mentioned with the radiation therapy planning assistant that Lawrence Court has been spearheading. That's really been a driver to make this to have procedures that are automated. So it's really about automation and of course associated trust in the system, and reduces the time and the touch points to enable the technology to be deployed in a more global setting. And with people in low and middle income countries are buying like high-end technology, so that the technology platforms are there. We just need to make sure that the amount of work needed to efficiently implemented these solutions, and that the patient treatment time is efficient and short, because they're treating a lot more patients per day as well. So it's really just sort of thinking about the whole process to enable us to have that global mission.
Okay, thank you. As you would imagine, there are a number of questions coming in about the product that you'll be demonstrating at ESTRO. So I'll just kind of march through those. To the extent that you can describe a little bit more about what's in store, can you tell us what type of product that C-Treat is currently focusing on first?
Right, yeah, and thank you. And yes, we will be showing the product at ESTRO. But so there's a couple of I guess things that have really been driving the development. And one, it's about time, and I think it's about time. There's sort of the dual meaning. The first meaning of just like saving time in the automated process, but the other is, and yeah, get a bit passionate about this, but the patient expectations that adaptive radiotherapy, this is like 28 years ago sort of was developed, and we're still not, most of the patients are missing out on this technology. So I think it's about time as a real something that we sort of want to have implemented. I mean, every patient's anatomy changes during treatment, and why aren't there tools to account for that? This is what I would like my friends and family to be to have access to these tools. I think that so it's one of the things sort of driving the product development, and the other is just really looking at the patient for every fraction. So every time the patient is treated, there's an evaluation. And currently there's the two sort of approaches to offline is sort of like an ad hoc, which would be looking at, okay, maybe the mask has shrunk. So is this a time we should be looking at? We should be looking at adapting, or saying, okay, at week 3, then we'll be adapting. And maybe there isn't a change at week 3, but there is at week 5. Maybe for this patient, there's a change at week 1. So just if we can automate the process, we can get information on a much more granular scale and make better decisions with less effort. And I think that that's sort of what people will be seeing when the product is released.
Okay, thank you. This next one, I'm not sure exactly what it means. I'm going to ask you because perhaps it's a more technical terminology, but it's how does C-Treat approach the lack of ground truth, the ground truth problem offline?
Oh yeah, I mean that's I think that's a challenge for essentially all of all of medical imaging. I mean we take in a CT scan of a patient, there's no ground truth, and sort of we trust so we can use phantoms, but there's no medical image of a patient do we have ground truth, and that's true of some of the processes that we're using. From deformable image registration. But there are steps for each of the processes. So for example, for measuring the accuracy of deformable image registration, then the target registration error is the most commonly used tool, and we'll use AAPM TG132 guidelines following that to assess the accuracy. Contour propagation, that's really we're sort of relying on human ground truth for that, and is it something that clinicians feel comfortable with using? And then we have for the dose calculation, then we have AAPM guidelines on what an acceptable match between the dose distributions are, and typically that's a 95% passing a 3% 2 millimeter gamma criteria. So there are both tools and benchmarks for each of those, but that is the lack of ground truth is something that we and the community really works very hard on.
Okay, next question. Are the RADONC generated targets deformed during the DIR? Are there any restrictions on how much they might change?
Right. So yeah, that's a good question. Every patient is different, and of course, with time, there will be differences. And I think that comes down to the amount of data set that is used for testing models, and the regulatory bodies are really looking at how diverse is your data sets in terms of being representative of patients being treated. And so we want to have to make sure that the data sets that we're testing on across each of the different body sites, that we do have that those significant changes, so that there aren't sort of the outliers, and we can manage the cases where there's large deformations or small deformations as well.
Okay, thank you. Can you describe more about how the product is different? There are a number of questions coming in around, follow on deformable image registration working properly when it's automatic. You covered that a little bit, but any other things that you can describe the product differences from what's available today?
Sure. I think probably one of the two of the key things are really just that just sort of the user-centered design, and really thinking about sort of the workflow and the data flow, and where people need to interact with the system and where they don't, and having I think the time taken that's been reported in the literature, a lot of that is due to moving data from one system to another. So having a sort of I guess a complete decision support system in one software package is, I think, one of the key differences. And then just the interaction with the system, and a lot of road testing with different clinics to understand and to work out, well, what information do people need when. So I think it's really been about the design process, and obviously underpinned by a lot of scientific development and rigor for each of the core processes, and built on top of that the interface and the automation, so that the experience for the clinic means that decisions and information is that the right information is being made in an automated way and is very easily accessible and digestible to those who need to make the decisions.
Okay, thank you. Just to the audience, we have time for a couple more questions. There are a number of questions coming in around some housekeeping issues. What if I can't get to Estro? How do I get more information? So just as a reminder, everyone who is attending this session will receive a link to the recording via email. And you can simply respond to that email to request interest. You can also contact us by going through the C-Treat website, and there'll be additional information on how you can receive a product demonstration if you will not be available at Estro. So another question coming in here, can you describe more, you had just mentioned about decision support. Can you describe some of the ways that you can provide meaningful and objective decision support?
Okay, yeah, and that's a great question, and I think there's two ways. One is to say, what are your clinically adaptive, what are your clinical decisions are used for adaptive therapy now in the clinic, and if that is protocolized, then that can be entered as a protocol into the product. And the other is to say, well, that there are a number of published adaptive protocols out there that have been nicely put together in the guidelines, the NRG guidelines, and so there is sort of an appendix for the volume changes, the dose changes that are needed. So either you do your own or you adapt what other people have done in the literature. But that is a good question. So I think that we want to give the clinics the power to do their own thing, but also that not necessarily to reinvent the wheel if they're not as familiar with adaptive therapy, because there's others have done this before, and really to leverage the experience of others.
Okay, thank you. That is our final question today, Professor Keall. So on behalf of C-Treat, I would like to thank everyone for your attention today. If you have any questions at all, just feel free to reach out to C-Treat via the C-Treat website. That's ctreatmedical.com. I'm personally looking forward to seeing that current practice flip, Professor Keall, where 97% of patients are receiving adaptive radiation therapy and not missing out. So I'm excited to see what's in store at Estro. And thanks again, everyone, for your attention. And with that, I will close today's session. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you, Christy. Thanks to the attendees.